The cold was a physical thing in the town square. It was a predator that sank its teeth into the frozen mud and breathed a fog that clung to the rough-hewn timbers of the general store. It sought out the thinnest coats, the most worn-out boots, and settled deep into the bones of anyone foolish enough to stand still for too long. The rancher stood still. He was a solid, deliberate shape against the shifting grayness of the afternoon, his gaze fixed not on the supplies being loaded into his wagon, but on the small, miserable spectacle unfolding near the sheriff's office. He had come to town for salt blocks and flour, for the tiny jar of peppermint candy his daughter loved, and for a silence in his cabin that was becoming too loud to bear. It had been a year since his wife had been taken by the fever, a year since the house had lost its center, leaving him and the child orbiting a cold, empty space. He had learned the rhythms of grief, the way it ebbed and flowed like a tide of thick, black oil. But his daughter, she knew only the absence. Her silence was different from his. His was a choice, hers was a wound. That was why he watched. A man from the city, dressed in a wool coat, too fine for this territory, was holding a sheaf of papers and speaking in a voice that slid over the crowd like grease on a hot skillet. Beside him, huddled into a threadbare shawl that offered more prayer than protection, stood a girl. She could not have been more than 17, her face pale and pinched, her eyes fixed on a loose board in the town's boardwalk as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. She was an outsider. Her features, the dark, straight fall of her hair, the subtle cast of her cheekbones, marked her as from somewhere far away, a place of different suns and different sorrows. The man from the city was not selling a horse or a claim. He was selling a contract, an indenture. The girl, he explained with a dismissive wave of his hand, was an orphan, indebted to his family's estate for her passage and keep. An unfortunate matter, but business was business. He was liquidating assets before returning east. The paper represented 5 years of labor. The crowd watched with a mixture of pity and suspicion, the way people watch a wolf caught in a trap. They felt for its pain but would not get close enough to help. The rancher felt something else, not pity. Pity was a useless emotion, a warm breath that fogged a window for a moment before vanishing. He felt a cold, hard pragmatism take root in his gut. He saw the tremble in the girl's hands, the rigid set of her shoulders, and he did not see a victim. He saw a solution to a problem he could no longer ignore. His daughter needed a woman's hand. She needed warmth, a soft voice to read her stories, someone to braid her hair without the clumsy fumbling of his own calloused fingers. The town's matrons, led by the cattle baron's wife, had made their offers, their voices dripping with saccharine concern that barely masked their predatory desire to sink their claws into his land and his life. He had rebuffed them all, earning their collective simmering scorn. This girl, however, was a blank slate. She was desperation in human form. She would ask for nothing but survival. He shifted his weight, the movement drawing the auctioneer's eye. "What's the price on the paper?" The rancher's voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a voice accustomed to calling cattle over vast distances, not to haggling in a town square. The man from the city smiled, a flash of white teeth that did not reach his eyes. "A man of business. I like that. The debt is considerable. Let us start the bidding at $50. A few men shuffled their feet. $50 was a steep price for a contract on a slip of a girl who looked like a harsh wind could snap her in two. The rancher saw the cattle baron's wife standing near the mercantile, her arms crossed, a look of profound disapproval etched onto her face. He knew what she was thinking. He knew what they were all thinking. 75, the rancher said, his voice flat, cutting through the murmurs. He did not look at the girl. He looked at the paper in the man's hand, the legal chain that bound her. The man from the city's eyebrows went up. He had expected a struggle. 75 is the bid. A fine offer for a guaranteed 5 years of domestic service. Strong girl, despite her appearance. Healthy, he gave her a little nudge and she flinched, wrapping her shawl tighter. The rancher's jaw tightened. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat. "That's not a bid. It's an offer. Take it or leave it. I have stock to feed." He let the finality of the statement hang in the frozen air. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. The city man's slick demeanor faltered. He looked at the hard, unyielding face of the rancher, at the cold eyes that promised no further discussion, and he saw his profit margin for the day. He had paid nothing for the girl. Her parents' debt was a fiction he had concocted. $75 was pure gain. Sold, he said quickly, snatching the pouch from the rancher's hand before he could change his mind. He counted the coins, signed the paper with a flourish, and handed it over. Without a backward glance at the girl, he turned and walked toward the hotel, his business concluded. The paper felt strange in the rancher's hand. It was brittle and official, a flimsy thing to hold so much power. He tucked it into his coat pocket and finally looked at the girl. Her head was still bowed. "The wagon's over there," he said, his tone no warmer than it had been a moment before. He turned and walked away, not checking to see if she followed. He knew she would. She had nowhere else to go. She followed. Her legs felt like hollow reeds, ready to buckle with each step across the rutted street. The world had narrowed to the back of the rancher's worn sheepskin coat, a broad and unreadable landscape. He did not speak to her again as he finished securing his supplies, his movements economical and sure. He moved like a man who had stripped everything from his life but the essential. When he was done, he gestured to the wagon seat. His daughter was already there, a small bundled figure with wide, solemn eyes the color of a winter sky, the same color as her father's. The journey to the homestead was a study in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the weary snort of the horses, and the relentless sigh of the wind. The rancher did not speak. The girl did not dare to. She sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling the searching gaze of the small child beside her. The cold was a constant, seeping thing, but the child's stare was somehow colder, more penetrating. It was the sterile curiosity of a creature encountering a new and unknown species. As the last vestiges of the town fell away, replaced by a rolling expanse of snow-dusted prairie and the dark, jagged line of distant mountains, the isolation became absolute. This was a land that did not care for people. It tolerated them, but it would just as soon erase them with a blizzard or a drought. The rancher seemed a part of it, his profile as stark and weathered as the rock formations they passed. He belonged to this emptiness. She was an intrusion, a foreign object dropped into a closed system. The little girl, who had not made a sound, slowly, tentatively, slid a small, mittened hand from beneath her blanket and placed it on the girl's arm. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of examination. The girl flinched at the unexpected contact. The child's eyes, wide and unblinking, met hers. There was no judgment in them, only a profound, unnerving stillness. The rancher saw the movement from the corner of his eyes, but said nothing. He simply pulled a heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and tossed it into the girl's lap. It was not an act of kindness. It was an act of preservation, like checking the cinch on a saddle or covering a woodpile before a storm. She was a necessity he had acquired, and he would see to her maintenance. They arrived as the sun was bleeding its last pale light across the horizon, staining the snow in shades of bruised violet and rose. The homestead was nestled in a small valley, protected on one side by a stand of skeletal cottonwoods. It was comprised of a sturdy-looking cabin, a large barn, and a few smaller outbuildings, all constructed with a brutal simplicity that spoke of function over any thought of comfort. Smoke curled from the cabin's stone chimney, a lonely gray ribbon against the deepening twilight. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. Inside, the cabin was immaculately clean and profoundly empty. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the bare wooden walls. There was a large table with two chairs, a dry sink, and a bed in one corner. A ladder led to a sleeping loft. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a lingering, suffocating silence. This was the space his grief had carved out, and he had kept it swept clean of anything that resembled life. He gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourself." He began to unload the supplies, his movements precise. The child slid off her chair and stood near the hearth, watching the new girl with that same unnerving focus. The rancher prepared a simple meal of bacon and beans. He placed a plate before her on the table, another for his daughter, and took his own standing by the counter. They ate in the same silence that had filled the wagon. The girl ate ravenously, shame warring with a hunger so deep it was a physical pain. The rancher watched with a detached curiosity, his expression giving nothing away. He was assessing his purchase, she thought, checking for flaws. When the meal was over, he pointed to the loft. "You'll sleep there. Blankets are in the trunk." He then turned his attention to his daughter, his entire demeanor softening in a way that was both startling and painful to witness. The hard lines of his face eased, and a flicker of something like warmth entered his eyes. He knelt before her, his large, rough hands gently unbuttoning her coat. He spoke to her in a low murmur, words the girl could not quite hear, but the tone was a language all its own. It was the sound of a carefully guarded treasure. He carried the child to the bed in the corner, tucking her in with a tenderness that seemed entirely out of place in this harsh man and his barren home. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, his back to the room, a silent sentinel. The girl, feeling like an intruder on a sacred rite, quietly gathered the plates and washed them at the dry sink, the scrape of tin on tin sounding like a desecration in the quiet room. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her limbs aching with a weariness that went beyond the physical. The loft was as bare as the room below, containing only a straw-stuffed mattress and a wooden trunk. She pulled out two heavy wool blankets and wrapped herself in them. But the cold was not just in the air, it was inside her, a frozen knot of fear and uncertainty. She lay there, listening to the man's quiet movements below, the soft crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind against the roof. This was her new reality, a cold loft, a silent man, and a life measured in 5 years of servitude. Sleep would not come. She stared into the darkness, her mind replaying the humiliation of the town square, the cold weight of the rancher's gaze. Sometime later, she heard a soft sound from below, a small, rustling movement. She peered over the edge of the loft. The little girl was standing in the middle of the room, a small white ghost in her nightgown, bathed in the dying orange glow of the fire's embers. She was looking up at the loft. "Are you my new mama?" The child's voice was a whisper, a fragile, hopeful thing in the vast, empty room. The question struck the girl with the force of a physical blow. She did not know how to answer. Down below, the rancher, who had been sitting in a chair by the hearth, went utterly still. The silence that followed was charged, heavy, with the weight of a name that had not been spoken in this house for a year. He did not turn. He did not speak. He just sat there, his shoulders rigid, a man turned to stone. The girl looked down at the child's upturned face, at the desperate hope shining in her wide eyes. She thought of her own mother, a warm, distant memory. She thought of the cold, hard coin in the city man's hand. She thought of the 5 years that stretched before her like a barren road, and in that moment, she understood that survival was not just about food and shelter. It was about finding something to hold on to. "Go back to bed, little one," she whispered down, her voice. It's cold." The child did not move. After a long moment, the rancher rose without a word, lifted his daughter, and carried her back to her bed. He did not look up at the loft, but the girl knew he had heard. The question, sharp as a shard of glass, now lay between them all. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unyielding routine. The rancher would rise before dawn, his movements quiet but purposeful, and be out of the cabin before the first light touched the snow. He was a man restless with work, always mending fences, tending to the small herd of cattle, chopping wood, his energy a constant, silent reproach to the stillness of the land. The girl would rise with him, rekindle the fire, and prepare a simple breakfast. She learned the rhythms of the house, the specific way he liked his coffee, the precise amount of bacon to fry. She worked with a fierce, quiet determination, scrubbing the floors until the wood gleamed, mending the child's clothes, organizing the pantry. It was not a plea for approval, it was a statement. She would not be a burden. She would earn her keep and more. Her relationship with the child was a delicate, unspoken thing. The little girl followed her everywhere, a silent shadow with solemn eyes. She did not ask the question again, but it hung in the air between them. The girl would read to her from the one book in the house, a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales, her voice soft and even. She would brush the child's fine, blonde hair, her fingers gentle as she worked out the tangles. She discovered the child loved the smell of cinnamon and began adding a pinch to the morning oatmeal. Small acts of care. dropped like pebbles into the deep stillness of the child's loneliness. The rancher observed it all from a distance. He would come in from the cold, his face raw from the wind, and stand for a moment in the doorway taking in the scene. The girl and his daughter sitting by the fire, their heads bent over a book, the air filled with a quiet warmth that had been absent for so long it felt alien. He felt a disquieting sensation, a thawing in a place he had thought permanently frozen. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope was a danger. He had built his life on the solid foundation of its absence. He rarely spoke to the girl directly. His communication was in gestures. A nod of acknowledgement for a well-cooked meal, a pile of freshly split wood left by the door, an extra blanket he'd brought down from a trunk in the barn. He was providing for physical needs, fulfilling his end of the contract. He told himself that was all it was. But he found himself watching her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the efficiency of her movements, the quiet dignity she maintained despite her circumstance. He had bought a servant, but he had received something more complex, something that did not fit neatly into the columns of a ledger. One afternoon, while cleaning out the main room, the girl found a small, carved wooden bird tucked away on the highest shelf of the pantry. It was worn smooth with handling, its painted details faded. She was holding it when the rancher came in. He stopped dead, his eyes fixing on the object in her hand. "Where did you get that?" His voice was sharp, accusatory. She flinched, holding it out to him. "It was on the shelf. I was dusting." He took it from her, his fingers closing around it possessively. He stared at it for a long moment, his face a mask of grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. "My wife," he said, the words barely a whisper. "She carved it." He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving the girl standing in a silence that was heavier than any before. She had trespassed, stumbled into the heart of his pain, and she did not know the way out. The thaw came late that year, a reluctant surrender of winter to a pale, watery spring. The snow receded, river brown, sleeping earth beneath. With the changing season came a visitor. The girl saw the buggy approaching from a long way off, a black insect crawling across the vast landscape. The rancher, who was repairing a corral fence, straightened up, his body going tense. "Go inside," he said to the girl, who was hanging laundry on a line. "Take the child with you." His tone left no room for argument. It was the cattle baron's wife. She was as a large woman, corseted into a severe shape and dressed in dark, expensive wool. She descended from the buggy with the air of a queen visiting a remote and distasteful colony. Her eyes, small and sharp, missed nothing. They swept over the tidy cabin, the repaired fence, and finally landed on the rancher, a look of condescending pity on her face. "I came to see how you were managing," she announced, her voice carrying on the crisp air. "The town has been so worried. A man alone with a child isn't right." "We're managing," the rancher said, his voice flat. He did not invite her in. He stood before his cabin like a gate. Her gaze flickered toward the cabin door, where the girl had retreated but was still visible. "And I heard you've acquired help." The word was loaded with insinuation. "A young woman of uncertain origin. People are talking. They say it is not a proper arrangement." The rancher's eyes, which had been fixed on the distant mountains, slowly moved to meet hers. The cold in them was more profound than any winter wind. "What people say is their business. What happens on my land is mine." The woman's lips thinned into a bloodless line. She had expected a man weakened by grief, a man who would be grateful for her guidance. She had not expected this granite wall of defiance. "It reflects on the whole community. A man of your standing, taking in a purchased girl. It sets a poor example. There are moral considerations. And the child, what kind of influence is she for a motherless girl?" The girl, standing just inside the doorway with the child clinging to her skirt, felt a hot flush of shame. She was a stain, a blight on this man's life. She was the source of the town's gossip, the reason for this woman's venom. The rancher took a slow step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet authority in his posture was more intimidating than any shout. "The girl is a hard worker. She is decent, and she is kind to my daughter. That is more than I can say for the concern I've been offered by others." He paused, letting the words land. "She is under my protection. You are not welcome here. Do not come back." It was a dismissal so absolute, so unexpected, that the cattle baron's wife was left momentarily speechless, her face mottled with fury. She had come to assert her dominance, to remind this grieving recluse of the social order. Instead, she had been turned away like a common peddler. She drew herself up, her voice trembling with rage. "You will regret this. The town will not stand for it." She climbed back into her buggy, her movements stiff and jerky, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and righteous indignation in her wake. The fragile peace of the homestead had been shattered. The world had found them. The silence that descended after the buggy disappeared was heavy with unspoken things. The rancher stood for a long time, staring at the horizon, his hands clenched into fists at sides. The girl remained in the doorway, the child's face buried in her skirts. She was the cause of this. She had brought trouble to his door. That evening, the tension in the cabin was a palpable force. They ate their meal in silence, the air thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. After he had put his daughter to bed, the rancher did not retreat into his usual stony quiet. He stoked the fire, his movements slow and deliberate, and then he turned to her. "You heard what she said," he stated. It was not a question. She nodded, her eyes fixed on her hands, which were twisting a loose thread on her apron. "I am sorry. I did not mean to bring you shame." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her. He saw not a servant, not a contract, but a terrified young woman who had been made to feel worthless her entire life. He saw the same resilience, the same quiet defiance he had seen that first day in the town square. "You have brought me no shame," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She deals in shame. It's the only currency she has." He sighed, a weary, ragged sound. "But she is dangerous. She will use this against us." A question had been burning in her since the day he bought her contract, a question she had never dared to ask. But the events of the day had changed something. The wall between them had been breached. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you help me?" He walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit landscape. The silence stretched, and she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, freighted with a pain he had carried alone for too long. "Because the silence in this house was too loud," he began. "After my wife, after she was gone, quiet was a constant noise. I thought I could bear it. I thought work would be enough. But the child, my daughter, she started to disappear into it. She stopped talking for a week after the funeral. She just faded. I would look at her and see this terrible emptiness in her eyes. The same emptiness I felt in myself." He turned from the window, his face shadowed and stark in the firelight. "I saw you in that square, and you looked like you were already a ghost. And I saw him," he gestured vaguely, meaning the man from the city, "and I saw the town, and they were all just walking right through you. I didn't buy a servant. I bought a second voice for this house. I was trying to create a better kind of silence, one with a heartbeat in it." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, aching thing. It was more than she had ever expected from this closed-off man. His grief was no longer an abstraction. It was a living presence in the room. In his vulnerability, she found the courage for her own. She reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out a tiny, broken object. It was a butterfly carved from a piece of pale green jade. One of its wings snapped off. She held it out to him on the palm of her hand. "My mother gave this to me," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "She said it was for luck. We were farmers in a land far from here. The rains failed for 2 years. The collectors came. My father argued with them. He was killed. They took everything. My mother died on the ship coming here. The man from the city, he was the agent for the shipping company. He told me I owed him for my mother's passage as well as my own. He said the debt was his now. He owned me." She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time without fear. "He told me he would be back, that the contract he sold you was only temporary. He said he had a buyer in the mining camps to the west who would pay far more. He said he would come for me before the first snows of next winter." The rancher looked from the broken butterfly in her hand to the terror in her eyes. And in that moment, the entire dynamic shifted. She was not just a fellow survivor he had rescued from the town's judgment. She was a woman with a specific looming threat, a monster from her past that was coming for her. The cattle baron's wife was a problem of gossip and social standing. This was a problem of flesh and blood, of chains and ownership. He realized then that he had not just offered her a roof. He had, without intending to, offered her a fortress, and now the enemy was riding toward its walls. The spring deepened into a lush, vibrant summer. The valley turned green, and the days grew long and warm. An unspoken truce settled over the homestead. The rancher's defense of the girl had solidified their strange arrangement into something new. He was no longer just her master by contract. He was her protector by choice, and she was no longer just a servant. She was the keeper of the cabin's fragile, budding warmth. The child, caught in this gentle gravity, began to laugh again, a sound as bright and surprising as the wildflowers that bloomed on the hillsides. But a shadow lay beneath the sun-drenched peace. The girl's confession had become a quiet, ticking clock, counting down the days until the first snow. The rancher found himself watching the road from the east more often than he cared to admit. He began to reinforce the locks on the doors, to check his rifle with a meticulousness that went beyond simple maintenance. He was a man preparing for a siege. He also began to talk to her, not often, and not about the things that haunted them. He would talk about the land, about the cattle, about the way the wind shifted before a storm. He taught her to identify the different calls of the hawks that circled overhead. He showed her how to read the clouds. He was, in his own taciturn way, teaching her the language of this place, making her a part of it, grounding her so she could not be so easily swept away. One evening, he brought out a ledger from a locked chest beneath his bed. He opened it on the table. It was filled with columns of numbers and notes in his wife's elegant script. "My wife handled the books," he said, his voice quiet. "She was smart, smarter than me. She knew how to make this place run. Since she's been gone." He trailed off, gesturing to the last few pages, which were filled with his own cramped, uncertain figures. The ranch was losing money. Not much, but a steady, slow bleed. The girl looked at the ledger, at the neat columns and the messy ones. She had never spoken of it, but in her former life, her father had taught her letters and numbers. She had a quick, orderly mind. Tentatively, she reached out a finger and pointed to an entry. "This shipping cost," she said. "It seems too high. The company my man from the city worked for. They were known for overcharging on freight manifests." The rancher looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had assumed she was uneducated. He pushed the ledger toward her. "Show me." For the next 2 hours they sat together at the table, their heads bent over the book. She moved through the numbers with a quiet confidence, her finger tracing lines of income and expenditure. She found discrepancies, small overcharges, inefficient purchases. She saw a pattern of waste born from his grief and inattention. She was not just a domestic servant, she had a mind for business, a mind as sharp and practical as his wife's had been. As she worked, she revealed a hidden skill, a part of herself that had nothing to do with her tragedy or her servitude. She was proving her value in a way neither of them had ever anticipated. The rancher watched her, a slow, dawning respect replacing the protective pity he had felt. This was not a fragile bird to be sheltered. This was a partner. The realization settled into him, solid and undeniable. The thought was terrifying. It felt like a betrayal of his wife's memory. And yet, it also felt like the first breath of fresh air after being locked in a sealed room for a year. As the leaves on the cottonwoods began to turn from green to gold, the ticking clock grew louder. A sense of dread began to permeate the peaceful atmosphere of the homestead. The rancher made a trip to town, alone. He did not go to the general store. He went to the telegraph office. He was a man who kept to himself, but he had lived a life before this ranch, before his wife. He had contacts, men he had known in a different time, in different, harder places. He sent a single, coded message to an address in a city 1,000 miles away. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer cast into the wires. He asked for information on a shipping agent, the man who had sold him the contract. Then he returned to the ranch and waited. The first snow came early that year. It fell silently in the night, a soft white blanket that covered the valley and muffled the world in an eerie quiet. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. It was the signal. 2 days later they came. Two riders appeared on the eastern road, dark figures moving slowly against the vast whiteness of the snow. The rancher saw them from the barn. One was the man from the city, his fine wool coat looking absurdly out of place. The other was the town sheriff, a man who respected the law, but was known to bend to the will of the wealthy and powerful. They were not alone. Trailing behind them, at a respectable distance, was the cattle baron's wife, her buggy a black specter of vindicated triumph. She had come to watch him fall. The rancher's face became a mask of cold fury. He walked back to the cabin, his movements calm and deliberate. "He's here," he said to the girl. She was standing by the window, her face as white as the snow outside. The child, sensing the fear, was clinging to her leg. "Take the child to the loft. Stay there. Do not come down, no matter what you hear." She wanted to argue, to stand with him, but she saw the iron resolve in his eyes. She nodded, her throat too tight for words, and led the crying child up the ladder. Pulling it up behind her, the rancher took his rifle from the pegs above the door. He did not load it. He simply held it, its familiar weight a small comfort. He opened the cabin door and stood on the porch, waiting. The man from the city dismounted, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. "Rancher," he said, his tone oozing false cordiality, "I've come to conclude our business." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "He has a writ," the lawman said, his voice apologetic. "Says the indenture contract you bought was a temporary transfer. He's exercising his right to reclaim his property. It's all legal and stamped." "She's not property," the rancher said, his voice a low growl. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," the city man said, stepping forward and holding out a document. "According to the laws of this territory, she is an asset, and I've come to collect her. You have no legal standing here. You will hand her over, or the sheriff will be forced to arrest you for obstruction." He glanced back at the cattle baron's wife, sharing a look of victory. The rancher looked past him, at the long, empty road stretching back to the east, the telegraph. It had been his only hope, and it had failed. A cold knot of despair tightened in his chest. He had brought this girl into his home, made her a part of his life, and now he was going to lose her. He was going to fail her, just as he felt he had failed his wife. He braced his hand tightening on the rifle stock. He would not let them take her. Legal or not, he would not. "I'm not giving her to you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The sheriff sighed and began to dismount. "Don't make me do this," he said. It was then that they heard it. The sound of a horse ridden hard from the east, a lone rider pushing his mount through the deep snow. He was a boy from the telegraph office in town, his face red from the cold and the effort. He galloped into the yard, his horse heaving, and thrust a folded piece of paper at the rancher. "Came in just now," the boy panted, "marked urgent." The rancher took the paper, his fingers numb. The man from the city laughed. "A letter from a friend? A bit late for that, I'm afraid." The rancher unfolded the telegraph. He read the terse, coded message. His expression did not change, but the girl, peering through a crack in the loft floor, saw the tension in his shoulders release. Just slightly. It was enough. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. He looked at the sheriff. "You should read this," he said, his voice steady. He handed the paper over. The sheriff took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read the message. His eyes widened. He read it again, his mouth falling slightly open. He looked up from the paper, not at the rancher, but at the man from the city, and his entire demeanor changed. The apologetic lawman was gone, replaced by something hard and cold. "Well now," the sheriff said, his voice laced with a newfound authority. "This puts a different light on things." He swung his gaze to the city man. "It seems your name is not the one on this writ, and the company you claim to represent went bankrupt 3 years ago. According to this message from the federal marshal's office, you are wanted in 3 states for fraud, embezzlement, and human trafficking." The city man's face went slack, the color draining from it. His smug confidence evaporated, replaced by raw, animal panic. "That's a lie. It's a trick." "Is it?" the sheriff said, pulling his pistol from its holster with a smooth, practiced motion. "I'm willing to bet the federal marshal it's not. You're under arrest." The man made a desperate move, a lunge for his horse, but the sheriff was faster. He was on him in 2 strides, slamming him against the side of the wagon. The cattle baron's wife, who had been watching with gleeful anticipation, let out a small, strangled gasp. Her moment of triumph had curdled into a public humiliation. The entire foundation of her social crusade had been a fraud. Without a word, she snapped the reins of her buggy and fled, desperate to escape the scene of her own spectacular misjudgment. The rancher watched as the sheriff bound the sputtering, protesting man's hands. He had not moved from the porch. He had not fired a shot. He had won with a single piece of paper, a ghost of a voice from 1,000 miles away. The sheriff tipped his hat to the rancher. "Looks like you had it handled," he said, a newfound respect in his eyes. He hauled his prisoner onto his horse and rode away, leaving the rancher standing alone in the silent, snow-covered yard. The cabin door opened, and the girl stepped out, her face streaked with tears. She ran to him, not as a servant to a master, but as a person to her protector, her family. She stopped just before him, her hands clasped together. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," he said. He looked at her, at the child who was peeking out from behind her skirts, at the warm light spilling from the cabin he had built. He had bought her contract to fill a silence, and she had ended up saving him from it. The spring that followed was not a reluctant one. It came with a rush of warm air and melting snow, washing the valley clean. The homestead, which had once been a place of stark survival, transformed. The girl, no longer bound by any contract but the one she was writing on their lives each day, planted a garden by the cabin. Bright green shoots pushed their way through the dark, rich earth, a promise of life and color. The rancher found himself changing with the seasons. The hard, frozen ground of his grief had finally thawed. He began to build an addition to the cabin, the rhythmic sound of his hammer, a cheerful, industrious heartbeat in the valley. He was not just expanding a structure, he was making room. He was building a home. The laughter of his daughter, now a constant, bright sound, was the mortar that held the new logs together. He no longer saw his wife's ghost in the corners of the rooms. Instead, he saw the vibrant, living presence of the young woman who had brought his house and his heart back from the dead. He would watch her as she worked in her garden, her dark hair shining in the sun, and a feeling he had thought long buried would stir within him. It was not the same love he had felt for his wife. It was something new, something quieter, forged not in youthful passion but in shared hardship and mutual respect. It was a love that had grown slowly like a sturdy oak, its roots deep in the rocky soil of their shared survival. The town, in its own slow way, came to accept the new reality. The humiliation of the cattle baron's wife had been a delicious piece of gossip, and the story of the rancher's clever defeat of the city swindler had become a local legend. He was no longer seen as a tragic recluse, but as a quiet, formidable man who protected his own. The girl was no longer the purchased woman. She was the rancher's partner, the woman who ran his household with quiet efficiency and had brought the laughter back to his motherless child. They were left alone, granted the privacy and respect they had earned. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the three of them sat on the porch of the newly expanded cabin. The rancher had built a swing, and he and the girl sat on it, a comfortable silence between them, while the child played with the wooden bird in the dust at their feet. The bird was whole again. The rancher had painstakingly carved a new wing for it, sanding it smooth and fitting it perfectly into place. The child looked up from her play, her face serious. She looked at the girl and then at her father. "Mama," she said, her voice clear and certain. This time, it was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the rancher, her heart in her eyes. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. His gaze was steady, full of a quiet, unshakable peace. He looked down at his daughter and then back at the woman beside him. A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, spread across his face, lighting his eyes from within. "Yes," he said, his voice soft but firm, a promise and a declaration all in one. "That's right." They sat there together on the swing, their hands intertwined, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The air grew cool, filled with the soft sounds of the coming night. The loud, empty silence was gone forever, replaced by the gentle, living quiet of a family. A home was not the land you owned, he thought, or the roof you built. It was the people you chose to protect, the broken things you chose to mend, the new life you dared to build from the ashes of the old.